Alright, so I read this book called Hidden Valley Road by Robert Kolker. And to start off with some context, it's a story about a family with 12 children, half of which eventually obtained schizophrenia. The book is about their experiences, and we also learn how doctors and scientists inch closer to finding the cure. And then for my first comparison, I have this TED Talk by Dr. Lieberman, who talks about his one experience with AIDS, how in the 1970s it was also stigmatized and there was no cure. However, after several hundred victims, research was funded by the government, and later on, AZT was created to cure AIDS. This raises the question on why it can't be done the same for mental illness. And he's basically saying that unless the stigma for mental illness disappears, it'll be further away until we get a cure. And that relates to the text during the beginning of the 20th century, because concerning the nature and nurture debates, some researchers at the time were even saying people with mental illness aren't people at all. Lieberman talks about how we should advocate for mental illness as we do with other diseases like lung cancer, heart disease, and I thought this was important to mention because this is basically the opposite of what happened in the text. In fact, all the children in the Galvin family shamed their older brother by giving him the nickname Geekoid because he was always having his own delusions from schizophrenia. And in the end, there's this quote from Lindsay, a sense that their sacrifice may make it better for the future generations. I felt this was a powerful quote to wrap up my point because Lieberman talked about how sacrifices created the awareness society needed to end the stigma around AIDS. And in the text, it's portrayed how Lindsay's family is the subject of that. This shows immense character development because Lindsay went from a child who ran away to boarding school to ditch her sick family to now becoming their caretaker. And then my next comparison is this comic called Invincible Ignorance. And it's basically this scientist who has appeared to have done research and proven something, and when confronting another person, they deny the facts with fallacious reasonings for no other reason that they choose not to believe it. This relates to the text because I feel like the man in the text represents Mimi. While Donald was getting checked up for his odd behavior prior to being diagnosed as having schizophrenia, the parents had their doctor write a letter to Donald's university saying that everything was all right, even though it clearly wasn't, because Donald had murdered a cat, and that would foreshadow his later actions. The reason this connection is so important is that it reveals the stigma of schizophrenia and other mental illnesses in general at the beginning of the 20th century. Another quote to back this up is, as long as Donald was well enough to try living somewhere else, these trips to Aspen would continue. So at the time, Don, who was the father of the 12 children, had a elite company and would often go to trips with all these prestigious individuals. So this just shows how the family didn't even think much of the illness and dismissed it in pursuit of other priorities. And it begs to ask the question if maybe nurture has a bigger, role than we initially thought it had, and maybe ridding stigma was the key, or was the catalyst to finding a cure. And then my third comparison, I have this song by Ed Sheeran called The A-Team, and it's basically about this cocaine addict, and it's evident in the lyrics such as breathing in snowflakes and going mad for a couple grams, which describe the substance abuse. And it relates through the text because all of the Galvin children abused drugs, even while they were still kids. One instance of this was Brian, who frequently held parties at the house for smoking pot, and eventually he moved on to LSD. The reason this resonates with limited knowledge of human psyche is that the drug addictions can actually cause mental damage, lead to confusion and decision making. And the thing is, the parents never even batted an eye because they said the fact that Brian might have been suffering unnoticed just as young Donald had never crossed their minds. To them, Brian was so talented, they didn't need to care for him. But there's all the more reason this is so important, because he eventually killed his ex-girlfriend and himself too. And it was discovered that he had schizophrenic behavior. This made me question this whole time why the parents never did anything about the consequences of his substance abuse. And as a bigger picture, it paints the fact that even seemingly talented, extraordinarily perfect people can still be affected by mental illness, which just shows how serious it is. And for my fourth comparison, I have this book called The Handmaid's Tale. And throughout the book, the prominent role women played in The Handmaid's Tale was being inferior to men. Like, they couldn't vote, they couldn't have jobs, they just couldn't do anything that would make them remotely equal to them. And one instance of sexism in the text is when Linda Leasy was working with his male co-workers, and they once wanted her to take the blame because they were up for promotion. So it just shows how arrogant some people were back then. And over here, there's this quote, and it's basically, Aunt Lydia placing the blame on women victims being raped rather than the men that instigated it. And that reminds me in the text when Lindsay, the daughter, confessed that Jim, her older brother, had molested her. But the mom, Mimi, she basically did nothing, dismissed the fact, and said that, well, he had schizophrenia, so it's not that big of a deal. I think this is really important overall because it shows how even people surrounded by mental illness are affected. Through art as a symbol, Margaret's paintings depict a lot of her own struggles in life, such as flowers that her mother loved. So despite Margaret appearing to resent her mom, she still had connection to her and loved her, and hated it when she was being shipped away, because she felt if Mimi loved her, she wouldn't do such a thing. And we also see her own experience being sexually abused by Jim when she drew all the Galvin children, but Jim was colored spectral black and white, which are dark and empty. All the other family members had colors such as pink, which perhaps harbored positive emotions, and it makes you wonder how much more happy Margaret and Lindsay could have been had they not been ostracized by their mother. And for my final comparison, I have this painting by Gertler. I chose this painting because it represents a symbol to display the nature versus nurture arguments in Hidden Valley Road. As opposed to normal merry-go-rounds, this one has a more satirical and dark theme, which I thought best describes the nature versus nurture arguments in the book, because in pursuit of finding a cure, it's best to avoid fighting, but fighting is just exactly what happened. As Rue L. Cromwell described the researchers finding the cure to schizophrenia, everyone is so focused on finding their own remedy to the illness that they exclude possibilities of others, so no one is working together. Like a merry-go-round, the ride is thrilling, but at the end of the day, the people are just going in circles and no progress is actually made. A quote to back this up is, "Unwillingness to collaborate leaves everyone vulnerable to confirmation bias." So this proves that everyone wants to believe that their own beliefs are true and just dismiss everyone else's ideas. This is significant because we can imagine how much more work researchers would have accomplished had they all worked together, because in the end, schizophrenia was just the culmination of many different discoveries. From the success of prevention and doctors being encouraged to spend more time with their patients, both nature and nurture are having an effect to cure schizophrenia. There's also the spectrum of someone's illness that we could see, how some people could be more prone to schizophrenia than others and have different reactions to them. So it's basically like we could have seen how much more they could have done had they worked together, the nature and nurture debaters. And these are my works cited.